Well, it is recording.
Oh, yeah, but you can set it up so it records on each computer independently.
Okay, Kyla, can you come and give us a hand here, because you're the Zoom. Anthony wants to record a copy of the meeting on his laptop.
Sorry?
Anthony wants to record a
much
copy
better with that.
Maybe that with this system.
It's on the Zoom. You've got to go to your Zoom settings if your co-host permission.
Well, I'll do that again. That's
I still remember what we had to host. That is really good. So now if I so
and then a person would present from a piece of paper.
I think I might have recording on your cloud. When you recording on your cloud and I'm recording on my own cloud. Yeah. So
no, I mean. Okay.
Good, you're planning on starting that.
Yes, I've got this credit video in one of my slides, and that's gonna work out. It's just gonna capture whatever my computer says. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to welcome you to the Africa Media Matrix and to have you join us for this very exciting talk. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Anthony. I'm sure for many of you, we don't need any introduction, but for those of you who are new to the department or who are not familiar with Anthony's work, he has long been an advocate for social justice, for survivor justice, for for us to really look carefully at how violence permeates our society and to make ways of making that visible and finding ways to redress and call out injustice of all kinds. He's looked specifically at gender-based violence, for example, as well as many other kinds of violence, as we're going to see today in his talk. Anthony, it's really lovely to have you back in the department. It's great to have you with us, and thanks for making yourself available. Looking forward to you today. Great.
Okay, thanks everyone. Those of you who know me know that this is going to be really depressing.
Before we begin, can the people online just put up or just wave or make a sign that you can hear us clearly? Yes. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Okay. So, how many of you have been watching like Gaza on your social media feeds for the past 2.5 years? I've been talking about that for 2 years now. I've been talking about this weird historical moment of being in this context of live stream genocide. So I've given a couple of talks specifically on the Gaza genocide, but I'm interested in this particular thing about it. Okay, and those of you who were there yesterday will hear like the refrain coming back. Is I'm interested in what the meanings of violence and the meanings of genocide. And what interests me really, okay, I don't seem to have control over the slides. Okay, does anyone know why that would be? Oh, so I just need to do that. Okay, yep. So I'm interested in the meanings that are created around violence. And so I want to start with two quotes about the meanings of genocide. And the first quote is from Hitler, 1939, just before he invades Poland. And he says, "Who, after all, speaks today about the annihilation of the Armenians?" And in 1939, the word genocide didn't exist, so he couldn't say the genocide of the Armenians. But one of the things that empowers him to begin the final solution to the Jewish problem, to begin the death camps, the Holocaust, is his awareness that people don't talk about the Armenian genocide, which had happened recently before the Nazi genocide. Okay. And I want to contrast that with a quote by Omar El-Akkad, who has written this book recently. I think it came out late 2024. And this is the full quote from which the title of his book comes. And the quote is, "One day, when it's safe, when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it is too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will always have been against this." And so he's written this book called "Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This." And so I'm interested in the space between no one remembering the Armenian genocide and in the future, one day, everyone will always have been against the Gaza genocide. Okay? And this is a kind of space of meanings. So when I watched this kind of horrific run of imagery and information, there's a couple of really specific questions that have been on my mind, which I've been working on now for 2.5 years. The first one, and there's a number of my talks available in papers, which is, why are there such different accounts of the genocide in Gaza? How do we understand that there are people who believe completely different versions of what is going on, and that there's a kind of an impossibility of them speaking to each other? Then I start kind of getting into a broader question. Is, why are there differences between the representation of Gaza and the representation of some other genocides? And I'm thinking specifically about Sudan. I'm trying to think about, why are people not involved with activism around Sudan the way they're involved with activism around Gaza? Why does it not kind of register on many people's kind of consciousness in the same way? And when I think about this, I think about another personal question, which is, why, when I learned about genocide, did I learn about the Holocaust? And why didn't I learn about the genocides that preceded the Holocaust? Why specifically didn't I learn about colonial genocides? Why was it only much later on, when I started reading decolonial theory at university, and I started reading books like King Leopold's Ghost, that I started realizing that, in fact, we live in a history of colonial genocides, which are not represented as such. So those three questions are questions that kind of lead to my current thinking. Okay. And something that I want to bring to the fore, but I've kind of already talked about it very specifically, is the newness of the idea of a live stream genocide. Okay. The fact that this was a technologically impossible process even a decade ago. And what's interesting about the representations of this genocide is that it internationally has occurred on social media. Okay? And what's interesting about that is that not only have the experiences of the victims been available on social media, but the perpetrators have posted their actions on social media, which is kind of counterintuitive. And so I want to understand, like, what was going on there, that the perpetrators of genocide actually celebrated their genocidal acts on social media, to the extent that that was all gathered up and is now being used for criminal investigations. That multiple IDF soldiers are being prosecuted around the world. The evidence is being used at the International Court of Justice. And there's a fantastic Al Jazeera documentary called Investigating War Crimes in Gaza, which the entire investigation is more or less assembled out of the footage posted online of IDF soldiers committing war crimes and celebrating themselves committing war crimes, okay? As opposed to my previous experience of genocides, and that really, I mean, for about a decade I worked on the Rwandan genocide. And it was a completely different experience because it was really hard to find out what happened in the Rwandan genocide. And we spent years doing extensive kind of interviews, writing up people's experiences, documenting it, publishing, to try and create a body of knowledge about the Rwandan genocide, which had kind of, people knew that it happened, but there was no sense of, tangible sense of like, how did this occur? And that's much more typical. Typically genocides are erased. They're not typically in the front of international media. Okay. And what interests me even more than that is having this live stream genocide, there seems to be three different kind of groupings of different ways of responding to it. And this also, I've got a paper and a video called Say No to Genocide, which really goes to much more depth. But I'm interested in the completely different ways people react to it. And the first way, which is actually the most common way of people reacting to genocides, is to avoid knowledge of them. So the extraordinary new capacity of social media is the extent to which you co-create your own feed. That's simply by not spending any time on something, by not clicking a response to something, by not reposting something. You down prioritize it versus if you engage with it, you up prioritize it. So the dominant international reaction was to not want to know. These are not nice images. This is not nice information. People choose a kind of to retain their kind of sanity and emotional stability by not knowing stuff and rather directing their streams of information towards other topics that are less traumatic to them. And that is pretty much the historical norm in terms of genocide. But there's another thing that is different from that avoidance, which is active denial. And if you've been on those particular feeds, one of the things you'll find is there's this entire kind of bot army of genocide denialists who reproduce kind of ritualistically this set of talking points around why this is definitely not a genocide. And there's a very limited number of them. Like if you do a little discourse analysis, there's only about 12 different points that they make. But they are very, very active, not only in not wanting to know about the genocide, but wanting to tell other people that what they think is not true and what they are seeing with their eyes is not true. And it needs to be understood differently. And once again, when we start looking at that, in fact, genocide denialism equally has a very long and active history. And then the third reaction to these kind of media streams is the idea of engagement. And apparently around a billion sort of pieces of online information have been reposted just around Gaza. A billion. That's significant in terms of the population of the world. Certainly much more than most kind of current events. And this engagement has become more than just a kind of a focal interest. It's led to a kind of international politics. It's led to kind of political organizing. It's led to massive international boycotts. It's led to criminal charges being placed against people. That it's interesting to note these three different choices that we have in the face of this kind of horrible information: to either make it go away, to say that what is being presented is a misrepresentation of what is going on, and what is going on is actually not that, or to kind of engage it in a positive, activist, transformative way. So what I want to focus on now is the contestation, the kind of denialist versus the recognition of genocide. And once again, those of you who were there yesterday, that's exactly what I was doing yesterday. I was doing it in a completely different context. I was doing the way in which accounts of violence tend to be contested. Most typically, in the first instance, they are contested between the victim and the perpetrator. There's a conflict of interest that victims typically want people to know about their suffering, and perpetrators typically want to conceal their crimes. And that sort of opens an initial pattern of contestation of representations of violence. But it's not even on the way to being the full story. Okay. And then that first category that I was talking about in the previous slide, that most people just don't want to know stuff. They don't want to know horrible stuff. And what we need to start looking at, and this is kind of, I guess, why I'm here, and I guess what I learned when I was here previously, is that to understand that, we need to understand the capacities of groups of people to assert and control narratives, and the kind of material conditions that make it possible to either control or not control a narrative: the economic conditions, the social conditions, the technological conditions that make it possible to control a narrative. And the first thing we need to point out is control of those narratives is unequal. Different groups have different access to different resources. So let's talk about the Holocaust then, okay, as the primary genocide narrative. It's not just the primary genocide narrative, it's literally why the word genocide exists. Before the Holocaust, that word did not exist in the English language. It was made up by the Polish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin. And he wrote extensively about this. He wanted to talk about the Nazi death camps and the program of the total annihilation of European Jews. And there was no legal term to talk about it. It extended so far beyond notions of homicide that it needed an entirely new conceptual term to talk about the destruction of an entire people. And so he developed the term genocide, and then kind of advocated for that, and it became the basis of what we now have as international genocide law, which is the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So when South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice, they took them there on the basis of this 1948 convention, which most countries are signatories to. And it led to a kind of research field of genocide studies, okay? But what's interesting is how we think about the Holocaust now is not how people thought about it immediately after it happened. There was a kind of a silence during the 1950s and 60s where people knew what had happened, and there'd been Nuremberg trials and people had been executed. But the cultural form of Holocaust memory only started existing sort of 20 years and later after the Holocaust. And this points to the way in which accounts of genocide can kind of rise and fall depending on other things that are going on. Okay, and what's interesting is that the Holocaust then kind of was consolidated as the genocide, and that everything that is unlike it risks being kind of devalued as being not genocide, even if it fits with genocide theory and the legal terms of the Genocide Convention. But another thing started happening more recently, and this was specifically linked to the rise of the internet in the United States in the 1990s, is a kind of a wave of Holocaust denialism started rising, and it's been escalating since then. And this is specifically linked to the rise of white nationalism in the West, okay, specifically linked to emergent kind of neo-Nazi movements. So we now see, after the Second World War, kind of Nazism was fully culturally discredited in the West, and now it's kind of become popular again via a number of channels. And so we see these neo-Nazi parties re-emerging in Germany. Australia just recently had a National Socialist network that were running around doing Hitler salutes, and then they kind of banned them. They didn't really ban them, but and there's huge neo-Nazi movement, especially in the United States, which is absolutely critical to Trumpism. Like neo-Nazi white supremacism and Trumpism, which I talked about yesterday, are absolutely enmeshed. But one of the key things that's linked to neo-Nazism is Holocaust denialism, and a contestation around the facts of that genocide. But what's weird to me looking at that is that the same people who are overtly anti-Semitic, overtly white supremacist, overtly neo-Nazi, overtly Holocaust denialist are often also supporters of Israel. And I don't know if you've noticed that. I don't know if you've noticed this weird alliance of what should be enemies. And that alliance is really quite simple, is because they regard Jewish people as 1 degree more white than Middle Eastern people. So on their spectrum of hate, they hate Jewish people, but they hate Middle Eastern people more. So Zionism is an ally in the kind of colonial control of the Middle East. But it's a strategic and temporary partnership. They will, when they are able, get back to the core business of genocide of Jewish people. But until then, Zionism is a useful proxy. Now, what we've seen, certainly in the West, is that this denialism is not well received. Okay, that in most European countries, in the US, it's been well, not in the US so much, but in European countries, it's been actively criminalized. That are like in many countries, it's a criminal offense to engage in Holocaust denialism. And one of the key things is that denialism is seen as a fundamental marker of a kind of radical anti-Semitism. But as I said, Holocaust denialism is not unusual. It happens all the time. And certainly when I was growing up and I was at school and I was being propagandized with Christian national education, the fundamental denialism that was going on there is the denial of colonial genocide. Okay, and the fact that Western colonialism was essentially as a kind of core practice without which it could not have occurred. It was a genocidal project. It involved genocides of indigenous people. It involved ethnic cleansing of indigenous land. That wasn't an aberrant feature of it. That was a constitutive feature of colonialism. But at the same time, it presented itself as the opposite of that. It presented itself precisely as the civilizing mission. It presented itself as civilizing of the indigenous savages of the rest of the world. So the violent side of colonialism was attributed to indigenous people And there was a kind of a sanctification of the colonial project as being kind of saving the souls of the natives and bringing them science and culture and all of those kinds of things. And what's interesting to me is that that version of colonialism is having a bit of a heyday at the moment. It's coming back in force, despite having been fully discredited in between there. Okay, so to tell the story, to erase colonial genocides, you have to do a particular thing. And this is important because all genocides have to do this. You have to dehumanize the victims. You have to strip the victims of genocide of their human status. So you have to dehumanize indigenous people before you can ethnically cleanse them. You have to dehumanize, Hutu people in Rwanda before you can genocide them. And the whole kind of 1,000 years of Western anti-Semitism was about dehumanizing Jewish people, which created the condition of possibility of a full-blown genocide against European Jewish people. And the other mechanism that has to be there is that the victims of genocide have to lack the ability to present their experiences back into the dominant system. Because genocide doesn't just work by brute force, it works by legitimation, it works by ideological legitimation. That mostly, I don't know if this is true of every instance, to get away with violence on that scale, you have to sell it. You have to sell it to a certain audience. You have to sell it to the audience on which it is economically dependent. You have to sell it to the people who are going to be conscripted into it as the agents of violence, as the soldiers, as the death camp guards. So it needs an ideological legitimation always. Okay, and the ideological legitimation depends on the victims not having a counter apparatus of ideological legitimation, that they are not able to tell their story into that system. And that not being able to tell your story back to the system of power is a condition of possibility of genocide. Now, sometimes there was contestation, and I think some of the most interesting contestation in Western genocides happened around slavery. And that certain groups, particularly kind of radical Christian groups, started contesting the legitimacy of slavery to the point where its legitimacy collapsed and slavery was abandoned. Some people, my more Marxist friends, will argue because it was economically not the most advantageous form of exploitation anymore, but certainly also because it suffered a crisis of legitimacy. Similarly, one of the big African genocides, certainly bigger than the Holocaust, was the Belgian genocide in Congo, where they moved in and just killed half the population of the Congo, 12 million people, in staggeringly brutal ways. They didn't just kill them. I'm not going to just go and read King Leopold's Ghost. That is the key text if you want to understand the true soul of colonialism. It is in that book. Belgium tried to ban the book. But also, once again, a kind of like journalists from Europe, kind of, more sort of human rights journalists started reporting on the Congo genocide. And these Christian groups, sort of radical left-wing Christian groups, started reporting on the Congo genocide and going to Europe and publishing newspapers saying, hey, this is totally fucked. And the Congo genocide legitimacy collapsed. And King Leopold, who was doing it, it wasn't Belgium, it was like him, like one dude ran this genocide. He had to hand the Congo over to Belgium and help Belgium had to pretend that there wasn't a genocide and start to just have ordinary exploitation of African populations, not just genociding. So so these are kind of the sites of contestation and the collapses of legitimacy. And the collapses of legitimacy lead to the collapses of power. I think this is really serious. we need to look at very seriously, because one of the things I want to radically kind of oppose, and something I felt like really personally pissed off about for the last, well, not so much now, because in a sense the Gaza genocide is completed now. The Gaza doesn't exist anymore. Is well, not in its historical form, not in its 3,500-year cultural society and material legacy to that. Is this idea that genocides are primarily defeated militarily. They're like wars, that they're won, like the stronger army wins. And so for a long time I was talking to kind of anti-genocide activists, and they're like, yeah, Israel's running out of weapons and Iran's got these hypersonic missiles. And they were telling this triumphalist tale of the genocide ending through the military defeat of Israel. And I understand the psychological work of that kind of triumphalism, but it's bullshit. It's not a realistic historical narrative. Israel has faced a much greater threat to its genocide is the collapse of the legitimacy of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That it had a received historical legitimacy, which it managed in the most extraordinary way to chuck in the bin. I don't think a country has ever had received historical legitimacy as post-Holocaust the Zionist project. But they've pretty much managed to collapse that legitimation project now. Okay, so one of the consequences of the erasure of Western genocides is that it's allowed another bullshit story to survive, which is now what I was talking about yesterday, is the story behind kind of Trump is, have you seen Marco Rubio's speech from earlier this week? Okay. I've got feelings about that, okay? Because what he's trying to do in that speech, he's saying out loud what has been happening in US conservative politics, is that the Trumpist project is not about Donald Trump. It's literally about reinstating the 18th and 19th century colonial regime. And they're now saying it. They're now like, this is what we want to do. We think that decolonization was a mistake. We think that independence of the global south was a mistake. And we're not inferring this. They are saying that in words now. And that they want to institute a new global system of colonial power through military domination, but also through ideological legitimation.
And you've got a standing ovation.
I don't know what to say. You should be freaking out. Okay, this little pep talk comes in all of my analysis at a similar. You should really be freaking out about the re-legitimation of Western colonialism. This is possibly the single most dangerous thing that could be happening at the moment. The one good thing is that it's also bullshit, because it's a death rattle, because the West is collapsing economically and China is the new superpower. You just need to sit at home and wait. That's going to happen. And so they're desperately trying to be like, oh my God, we can't not be a superpower anymore. We can't not be the Übermensch anymore. We've got to reinvigorate colonialism and white supremacy. But they actually they can't deliver. They have the biggest army in human history. It's not big enough. And I'll talk to you about why BRICS is going to end this nonsense about Western civilization in another lecture. Okay, but there's this resurgent view of Western civilization as being like the thing that will save humanity. Is that will save humanity from kind of collapse in all its various forms. And this is what I was talking about yesterday. I'm not going to repeat myself. But my point is that the erasure of the intrinsically genocidal notion of Western colonialism is what supports this new Western infatuation with the idea of Western civilization. Okay, so then let's talk about this current colonial genocide, which is Gaza. Okay, and what I mentioned there. Take its course. Some people really our guests. Okay, so as I said before, what I've been working on, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm not going to repeat here that I've been working on, is the contestation around Gaza. These two different versions. Okay, so the one version, which is Israel is defending itself against terrorism version, versus the colonial ethnic cleansing of Palestine so it can be occupied by Western settlers version. Okay, and these versions they are incompatible. They cannot both be true in any sense. And what interests me is the way in which the evidence that has become available through this live stream, through these criminal investigations, changes some people's understanding and doesn't change other people's understanding. That as a social scientist, I was lied to, and I was told that evidence is what really kind of makes an argument convincing. And that's just not true. Evidence is not what makes an argument convincing. What makes an argument convincing is A, if it makes you feel nice to believe it, and B, if it can be meshed with what you already believe, if it's compatible with an existing system of your beliefs, so it doesn't feel anomalous, that it feels kind of commonsensical. So if it feels commonsensical because it dovetails in a good way with your existing beliefs and identifications and identity, and it makes you feel nice to believe it, then the evidence can do whatever it wants to do. People are not going to be especially persuaded. But the evidence does do something. And a lot of people in the West have shifted from a kind of a pre-Gaza genocide position to a post-Gaza genocide position, where they assume certain things about Israel and colonialism and the United States being a benign peacekeeper in the world, and Germany having learned from its own multiple historical genocides. And they have revised their take on that, and it's like, wow, that's just lies. And in fact, the West not only was historically colonially genocidal, it is in 2026 actively, proactively genocidal, because it is still proactively colonial. Okay, so my point, and once again, this was my point yesterday, is that the meaning of evidence is structured. Okay, it's not just the evidence; it's that the evidence that the evidence has meaning because of the bigger system of meanings in which it turns up. Now that can be ruptured. Okay, there are some kinds of evidence that evoke such kind of emotional impact that they actually break down the existing images. And this is why, like, there's that famous talk by that revolting Zionist media person where she's saying, like, I'm trying to sell Zionism to people, but they're just hearing it through this wall of children's bodies. And she's really lamenting the fact that people can't appreciate Zionism because they've seen too many dead Palestinian children's bodies. And we really need to fix this problem. That the Zionist project has to fix the problem of the visibility of dead Palestinian children's bodies so that Zionism can become credible again. And so those kind of scenes can rupture people's sense of reality and can cause them to need to reorganize it. Okay, that there's some things that are just so absolutely horrific. And I remember the scenes that ruptured my Christian national education. I remember as a teenager walking to library, the main municipal library in Gqeberha, and walking past the Barkin Street police station and hearing the screams of the prisoners being beaten in the police station and being like, that's not right. And then, because I asked that question, I started asking a whole lot more questions. And then those questions ended up leading to a kind of ideological collapse of the legitimacy of the system I'd been educated into, and me increasingly embracing an alternative explanatory system. So experience can change interpretative frameworks, but it's not always successful. Okay, but what's interesting, so how does the story of Israel defending itself against terrorism, despite being patently false, how does it carry a kind of ability to convince millions and millions of people? And we need to look at how it's constructed discursively, and this is really easy to kind of unpack, because two things have happened. Both the kind of Holocaust victimization discourses, the Jewish people of Europe as being the kind of ultimate victims, the ultimate victims of racism, the ultimate victims of anti-Semitism, that's gotten mapped from Europe onto the Middle East, which is interesting because anti-Semitism historically isn't a Middle Eastern phenomenon, it's a European phenomenon. It was developed and perfected in and by Europe. Whereas Middle Eastern societies historically were much more multicultural, okay? So on the one hand, the Holocaust victim discourse is kind of mapped onto Israel, and so any threat to Israel is seen as a kind of Holocaust reenactment. But also colonial discourse is mapped onto Israel. And there's this idea that all colonizers have. When you read colonial accounts, it's all of them being super nice and trying to make things nice, and then the natives are just attacking them. They can't understand why. They just don't know why indigenous people keep wanting to fight with them, just because they want their land back. And they don't want to be enslaved. And that doesn't make sense to the colonizers, okay? And so settlers, so there's this kind of story that these European settlers are going back to their ancestral land. And this is the critical kind of bullshit kernel in Zionism, is this idea of actually that the Ashkenazim are the indigenous people of Palestine, which has been demonstrated to be scientifically false at a purely genetic level, even so many times. But that doesn't put it to bed. It's still got a massive cultural life, okay? And so they went back to their ancestral land and they just got attacked, okay? And they've had to perpetually defend themselves against these anti-Semitic barbarians who just hate them because they're Jews, okay? And this is the essential inversion. They don't hate them because they are violent, predatory colonial land thieves who are ethnically cleansing indigenous people. They hate them because they're Jewish and they want to fight with them because they're savages. Okay, these are hundreds of year-old discourses that are being mobilized out of colonialism on the one hand, and then a 20th century discourse out of the Holocaust on the other hand. And these provide the legitimation framing of the Zionist project. Okay, so what we see here is this displacement that I've been explaining. Western anti-Semitism gets projected onto Arabs and Islam, and they start being categorized as the kind of sources of anti-Semitism. Colonial violence gets erased, and both the history of the British colonial violence in Palestine gets erased, and it's a really interesting history. If you want to dig into that, just read about the special night squads. That is if King Solomon's King Leopold's Ghost is a real education on African colonialism. Study on the special night squads is a real study of British colonialism in the Middle East. Okay, and essentially what they did is that the British equipped and trained a set of Zionist terrorist groups like Lehi, Haganah, Irgun, And these Zionist, this was before Israel even existed, these Zionist terrorist groups started this process of ethnic cleansing, started attacking villages, raping, murdering, driving people out of their homes and seizing and occupying that land. And so there's this whole kind of repressed history of terrorism having been introduced into the Middle East, having been conceptualized and perfected as a military practice by British and Zionist colonizers. And that history goes back to the 1920s. Okay. And so that has to be erased, and that history of Zionist terrorism as constitutive of the state of Israel has to then be projected onto everyone around Israel. And so you get this kind of narrative of like, well, they came back to their ancestral land, and this is the other kind of critique. And then the Arabs just attacked us. They just attacked us because they just hate us because we're just Jews. And the fact that the underlying process of ethnic cleansing had been well underway and well contested for a long time, that disappears. Okay. And it gets to a really specific, interesting, contemporary turning point, which another thing that I've worked on elsewhere is why was it necessary for Israel to lie about October the 7th? Because October the 7th is this kind of turning point in Zionism, right? And it's the turning point in where a kind of sustained historical process of violent ethnic cleansing escalates into a full-blown process of genocide, okay? And October the 7th, that kind of Hamas-led attack on Jewish settlers becomes the legitimating event, okay? And depending on how far you're prepared to go in this, I'm not going to go down there because then I'm going to have to get into fights with people. Okay, so the immediate account, the sort of pre-packaged account of that attack that was sold, and was specifically sold to the West, and was specifically sold to the great bastions of the West, the New York Times, the BBC, bought this, like they just bought the whole package and reproduced it out of the mouths of Israeli propagandists without any normal attempt to verify. That would be part of everyday journalistic practice. So you remember there was this, like all these 40 beheaded babies. This was the first story that Hamas had gone in and these Arab savages had just been beheading babies. Like, can you imagine what kind of non-human does a thing like that? And then there were the accounts, and this is where the New York Times is an egregious criminal offender, they reproduced this kind of genocide legitimating account. These accounts of fetishistic, sadistic sexual violence, like is absolutely unimaginably horrendous, kind of like worse than Epstein Island level accounts of not just sexual assault, but kind of grotesque sexual torture. And all of this was marketed immediately to the extent that it's implausible that it wasn't prepared beforehand, immediately after October 7th, okay? And it became part of this Western chorus of Israel has a right to defend itself. Like every Western politician ritualistically said this phrase over and over again, Israel has a right to defend itself, because of the construction of this horror that was meant to invoke the kind of affect of the horror of the Holocaust. Okay, it was also there to do some kind of demystifying work, which was to raise an important aspect of what did happen on October the 7th, which is a lot of the people that were killed, of those 1,200 people that were killed, were actually killed by the Israeli armed forces. Their houses were blown up by Israeli tanks. The vehicles that were taking hostages back into Gaza were blown up and shot by helicopter gunships. So we don't know what proportion, but perhaps the majority of the Israeli victims of October 7th were actually killed by the Israeli forces. And the beheaded baby / sexual violence mythology was meant to prevent it being possible to even ask that set of questions. And in fact, asking that set of questions, asking what actually happened on October 7th, has been formally criminalized in Israel. And although it's not formally criminalized in most Western countries, there's certainly a kind of an apparatus that if you start investigating those things, that you will end up losing your job as a journalist, you will end up being accused of anti-Semitism, you'll be accused of being a conspiracy theorist. And there isn't a lot of very, very accurate forensic data to draw on there, but there's definitely wide range of admissions by IDF personnel and others that they were actively instructed to do that the so-called Hannibal Directive, which is not a thing in military strategy and law, it's a specifically Israeli thing, and it was specifically condemned by the Israeli courts before this. They had said you may not implement the Hannibal Directive. And the Hannibal Directive is where Israeli military are told to kill Israeli citizens rather than allow them to be taken hostage. And that's just not a thing that is done in other countries, but it is a historical practice within Israeli political and military culture. Okay. So the Hannibal Directive we know now, it was invoked on October 7th. But what it mostly does is to erase the intelligibility of the Al-Aqsa flag. So what we know in the West as October 7th for the victims of colonization is the Al-Aqsa flag, which is a completely different thing, which is an act of decolonial resistance with a very specific goal. And this goal has to be erased. This is intolerable to kind of Western Zionism. That the goal was because why? I mean, it's the most obvious question you would ask as a journalist. You'd say, well, why did they do that attack? Surely that would end badly. Like that was crazy, right? No, it was a very conceptualized attack, and the taking of hostages, which you normally shouldn't do because that's an international crime. That's a crime against humanity. It's a crime under international. You do not take civilian hostages. So why would they risk breaching international law in order to take hostages? The simple reason is to organize a hostage swap. So you have this kind of 2 years of Western media about these 250 Israeli hostages in order to erase the fact of the 10,000 Palestinian hostages. And so the function of the Al-Aqsa flag was to take a few hostages to try and get Israel to release the Palestinian hostages that they've been holding. But at any point is between 3,000 and 10,000. So this hostage swap operation had to be kind of erased because it was intelligible and raised the fundamental question of why is Israel illegally holding Palestinian hostages? Okay, that question has to be erased from thought and from media and from the kind of public resources of intelligibility. So that's what the freak out about the beheaded babies is for. Then the other thing that has to happen is the Palestinian resistance has to be fully articulated as genocidal. Okay, so resistance to occupation and dispossession has to be constructed not as resistance but as aggression. And this is that without this reconstruction, Zionism falls apart in terms of kind of ethical legitimacy. Okay. And the way in which it's constructed as aggression, not as resistance, is by constructing it as anti-Semitic, saying that Palestinian resistance to colonization is the same as Nazi persecution of the Jews. These are the same thing. They are grotesque acts of brutal, genocidal anti-Semitism. And so we see, for instance, recently in Australia and places like Germany, the attempts to ban key Palestinian resistance phrases like globalize the intifada, from the river to the sea, to kind of criminalize these phrases on the basis of the allegation that these phrases are genocidal. Okay, that these are not decolonial resistance phrases. These are genocidal anti-Semitic mobilization phrases. Okay, and so there's that reframing from these being liberation slogans to being incitements to anti-Semitic genocide. And this was very, very successfully traditionally established in the West through kind of Zionist control of traditional Western media. And not only Zionist control of traditional Western media and the big Western media, not like little Western media, like the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They're not the kind of Western tabloids and extremists, like the cause of what people in the West think of as being good journalism, objective, neutral journalism. That, and not only that, but even pointing out the Zionist influence on those media institutions was then framed as anti-Semitic, was framed as being kind of neo-Nazi conspiracy theorizing about Jews controlling the world. So they did that, and that was all fine. Like they had all those apparatuses under control, but they made a fundamental critical mistake in the manufacture of ideological legitimacy. Is they didn't realize the extent to which young people were not reading the papers, they were online, and that they were getting their information online. And so the reason you've been able to watch a live stream genocide is because Zionism did not at that point yet control the algorithms of your media feeds. And so they lost control of the representation of the Gaza genocide, profoundly lost control of it. And they had a big freak out. And there's kind of interviews with the various sort of Zionist propagandists about the crisis. Like, what are we going to do? The numbers are a nightmare. We've lost the youth in the West. Like, they still had kind of boomers and people wrapped up ideologically, but there was an instant recognition that they had lost credibility amongst the Western youth. They never had really credibility in the global South. So there's not a whole lot to lose there, except amongst global South Christian Zionists. And that's a kettle of fish that I don't care to explore today, but I will mention it later. So they lost control of the narrative, and that's why I can stand in this room and talk about the Gaza genocide. But then they quickly realized their mistake and realized, like, if this colonial project is going to carry on existing, we are going to have to take control of social media the way we have control of the legacy Western media. And they've been very open about this. They've publicly said this is what we need to do. And one of the ways of doing it was a long-standing thing, which was massively ramped up, which is the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. To say that if you can't criticize Israel, you can't say Israel is committing a genocide, you can't describe them abducting doctors from hospitals and raping them to death, because to say any of those things, whether you've got objective proof or not, is intrinsically anti-Semitic, okay? So the conflation of the critique of Zionism and thus a critique of the genocide with anti-Semitism was very much ramped up in the West, and kind of catastrophically in places like Germany and the US. But then they realized they've got to control the algorithm, and they had a foot in the door with Meta, luckily. So it was really easy to get into Facebook and Instagram. But the catastrophe for Zionism is they had no control over TikTok. That was the door that had been left open for information about the Gaza genocide to reach the world. And I think I don't do like media positivism. The people who do that were like, yeah, there's like 300 sort of Palestinian posts compared for one Zionist post on TikTok. It is just a monstrous legitimation crisis. So then because of the control of the US politics via AIPAC, whole nother story, they managed to get the US to ban TikTok. and then to unban it on the condition that US TikTok was sold from international TikTok and became an independent subsidiary, specifically which could write its own algorithms, okay? And then they organized for the sale of that consortium to a specifically Zionist consortium, particularly the kind of, if we're going to have a rogue gallery of the evil people on earth at the moment, it's like Peter Thiel, Alex Karp, and then Larry Ellison. Okay, these sort of data surveillance military billionaires. And so Larry Ellison now has the controlling share in US TikTok and the explicit mandate to revise its algorithm to kind of try and reinstate the Zionist legitimation project, okay? And to bring young people in the West back into that kind of legitimation ideology. At the same time, they've massively, I think by order of magnitude, upped their funding of bot farms. So you know when you start reading comments on kind of atrocities in Palestine, there'll just be this horde of bots that will descend and start parroting these like Hasbro cliches, which are, I mean, this is a pre-packaging. You can actually download the Hasbro handbook off the internet. And it lists like these talking points that are reproduced. But previously they were paying like Israeli students to be online, sort of doing this, advancing these talking points. And now, of course, can be completely automated. You can just have AI automated bot farms that ordinary people can't really work against. I mean, unless they can get an equally kind of mega billionaire funded bot farm system on the other side and let the internet just collapse into a war of bots and humans just disappear in the ideological legitimation of AIs against each other. I kind of think that's where we're going. So here is, what is her name? I've forgotten her name. This is the basically the Zionist algorithm advisor from Meta. Okay, we are not getting sound. Oh, okay, we are not getting sound.
It is a privilege to represent Meta community worldwide. I am proud that Meta's commitment to addressing anti-Semitism on our platform has remained steadfast.
That's not really coming through, is it?
Our policies are leading Jewish people and Israelis on their platforms. Our community policies harassment, violence, and incitement, and include a robust framework to combat anti-Semitism. Hateful conduct policy is for Israelis and Jews. We banned Holocaust denial in 2020. Making on the rather than misinformation. It wasn't just about about protecting people from harmful conduct. We banned content with harmful stereotypes about Jews, such as the claim that Jews run the world or other major institutions. We updated our policies to ensure the term Zionist can be used as a proxy for Jews and Israelis. We banned content claiming Zionists run the world and control the media.
JMS.
Okay, I am muted on Zoom.
Bottom left.
There we go. Cool.
I don't need to do anything. Okay, so
Now mute the audio on your laptop.
okay, they're going to do it.
Yes.
Okay, so
Check if they can hear on that.
it's a kind of extraordinary little speech, this, and extraordinarily kind of unself-conscious for professional propagandists. Because what it's saying is that, well, we've consciously are trying to shift your social media feed towards Zionist legitimation. We're consciously trying to collapse critiques of the violence of Zionism, the genocide in Gaza, all of those things. We're consciously conflating those with anti-Semitism and trying and getting them classified as hate speech, so that they're not classified as political speech, because political speech is, in most circumstances, protected speech, but to have it reclassified as hate speech. Okay, but most of all, she stands there and says, we are taking control of the media by banning people who say that Jews control the media. I mean, it's a remarkable kind of moment in like I would fire this person if they were doing PR for my political initiative, okay? It's doing what the Trumpists are doing that I talked about. They're just saying the quiet part out loud now and expecting that no one is going to say, what? Like, what are you saying? Okay. So there's that. Okay. So I don't want to talk about Israel anymore. Where's Sudan? This is what I want to talk about. There's multiple genocides taking place at the moment. Big, very serious. These are not like a Bosnian genocide, 12,000 people. I'm not trivializing Bosnian genocide. But these are world historical, multiple hundreds, thousands of people, genocides taking place. And one of them has been happening for 3 years now in Sudan. And it's not appearing in the way that Gaza is appearing. And I want to know what's going on with that. Okay. Because as a genocide scholar, I'm not just interested in Palestine, I'm interested in all genocides. And I'm interested in this fundamental question that I asked at the beginning, which is why are some genocides prioritized and why are some genocides erased? So why is this invisible? And there's a couple of things we can look at, and we can look at the kind of the mechanisms of knowledge production around it, is that Sudan is not at the center of Western interests. There's not a lot of Western interests in minerals and oil, historical politics there. So it's not linked to Western interests. And what is really interesting, when Rwandan genocide was happening and the UN kind of went to the US and were like, hey, there's genocide happening in Rwanda, and the US turned around, literally said, what's our strategic interest in Rwanda? And it was like, there's no strategic interest in Rwanda, therefore they refused to call it a genocide, and they opposed. And this is one of the catastrophes in the global international legal infrastructure, is that these few countries have veto power over things like over intervening, like military intervention. The UN Security Council can order military intervention in a genocidal situation, but the US has veto power over that, which also means that Israel has veto power, and they've used it, I think, 47 times now. Okay, so there's no strategic interest, Western interests in Sudan, so bucket. It's also not embedded in kind of global English language media circuits of the kind that most of us would circulate in a lot of the time. But ultimately, I think the banality of evil is such that that there's a kind of there's a simple racist explanation of the non-attention to the Sudanese genocide, which is also why in '94 people in South Africa were not getting particularly concerned about the Rwandan genocide. Okay, is that Black lives do not matter to the West. They come and go. That part of colonial ideology is that, you know, people in the global South are just violent and they just wage war until they get civilized by the wonderful people from the West. And it kind of disappears into that multifaceted whole. But my point about this is that the impacts of non-representation, the impacts of the non-representation of the Sudanese genocide are as serious in terms of suffering and loss of life as the genocide denialism of Zionism. The one has this massive, positive, expensive, global apparatus of denialism, and the other just relies on a failure, a kind of a basic journalistic failure, basic failure of the international human rights apparatuses to intervene. And so although we tend to get a little bit more excited about genocide denialism, that genocide ignorance is every bit as consequential. The absence of genocide knowledge harms people as much as the denial of genocide knowledge. And I think we in a role, we need to confront a very profound ethical crisis around around the non-representation of the Sudanese genocide. But I want to deal with one last genocide, which is the end of the world. Always a happy note. Okay. So the science is in. On the current course of climate catastrophe, the global ecosystem is not going to be able to support human life in the foreseeable future. This is not a genocide of a particular social group. This is a genocide of the human race. The human race is going to be brought to an end because it does not serve early 21st century capitalism. And because early 21st capitalism has one hell of an ideological legitimation apparatus, because it controls stuff, because it controls all the money. Okay. What's interesting about this, okay, technically, I have to admit, as a genocide scholar, technically, if you're literally reading the categories of the Genocide Convention, it's not a genocide because it fails on one of the categories of Section 3, which is intention. And this is what's interesting. You don't just have to prove that genocide is taking place. You have to choose that someone intended for a genocide to take place. And that's usually in international law, that's the hard thing to prove in court, because genocide days are liars usually. And this is the great thing about the case against Israel is they literally went out. Everyone, right from Netanyahu, Gallant, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, they all just went on the media multiple times and said, our intention is to get rid of the Palestinian population. And so they proved that. But with the end of the world, with climate catastrophe, there's an absence of intention. And it points to a fundamental weakness in our genocide theory, is what when an entire category of people are being annihilated without a malicious intention, rather the problem of indifference, the problem of a lack of care that is in fact taking place, which is the Sudanese problem. The problem with Sudan is not genocide denialism, it's genocide nothing. It's a failure of the people who should be representing that catastrophe to represent it. Now, interestingly, there isn't a failure to represent climate catastrophe. The science is it's in the media. Guardian has columns on it. It's everywhere. Like everyone knows about climate catastrophe. It's this mass of highly authoritative data circulating in the highest political circles. The problem is that there's no connect between the knowledge and the practice. Okay? And the reason is because that knowledge conflicts with systems of power. Okay, and specifically it conflicts with economic systems. But the billionaire class need climate change not to be taken seriously. So they've done a bunch of things, and this is really interesting, is that they've engaged in a kind of climate genocide denialism. Okay, and so there's this global, highly resourced kind of climate change denialist knowledge production. There's a complete system, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for these dissident climate denialist scientists, massive funding for these kind of bogus scientific journals or other media platforms. And it's not just denialism. On the first instance, they're denying the scientific facts and then creating these sort of counterfacts, these like this counter knowledge of quasi-scientific knowledge. It's the construction of a set of conspiracy theories. So denialism doesn't just need someone to say that's not true. It needs to discredit in advance that whole system of knowledge by saying like, oh, there's a kind of a sinister system of people who are trying to, and this is straight out of kind of Trumpism, if you listen to them, that there's this group of people that are trying to undermine the United States and trying to undermine the West by crippling the economic power of Western industry, by creating these fake scientific claims about climate change, which actually isn't real. And several of my close friends are inside this particular conspiracy theory. They genuinely believe that climate science is fake. And of course, the other important thing they've done, which is, I said I wouldn't talk about this, but I will talk about it, is they've managed to I talked about plugging ideological discourses into existing systems. So they've got to plug climate denialism into like the need for the, for Western people that works, like we need the West to be rich, so we can't be changing how we produce and consume. But for people in the global South, it's like, we don't care about the West. So you go via religion, and you go via this kind of religious thing, yes, but that our Christianity tells us that God actually decides what happens. It's not like determined by human activities, it's God's plan, so we don't have to worry about climate collapse because Jesus. And that becomes a really powerful kind of ideological mechanism. And it's the same ideological mechanism that works for Christian Zionism. It's to say, like, Jesus is going to come back in Israel, and there's got to be this kind of apocalyptic moment of revelation. And so Zionism is good, and genocide and war in the Middle East is good because Jesus. Okay, got the same kind of building on an incredibly robust cultural ideological apparatus in the form of religion, and then taking a political ideology and making it mesh with that, so that the two start appearing as if they are one system, and that people experience them as one system. And that is top-class propaganda. If you want to get into your influencer regimes of power, you've got to be learning to do that kind of stuff. If you don't feel bad about genocides, you've got to get rid of the problem of ethics. And I'm sure you can even medicate that problem away if you try. But the important thing is the end of the world. That despite the massive science, because there are centers of power outside of science, and there are interests that supersede the interests of the survival of the human race, that the discursive battle for the end of the world remains contested. So I'll end now, sorry. So, a couple of points that we extract from this. Genocides are rendered easier or more difficult by systems of representation. You can only do a genocide if you've already sold a genocidal ideology. You've sold a master race ideology, if you've sold the persecution of the Jews as a motivation for the ethnic cleansing of the Middle East. It's got to plug into, otherwise it loses ideological legitimation, and if it loses ideological legitimation, you can't get people to do it anymore. And so you're either going to get your AI bots to do it all on their own, which they're working on, and they've almost solved that problem. You may not need any humans involved in the next genocide. Peter Thiel may just be able to put in some code, and then the robo assassins will do everything. They're already there. And that's yesterday I told you about the Palestine laboratory. Go read it after you've read King Leopold's Curse. Okay. The contestation of representation of genocides can involve both non-representation and counter-representation. It doesn't have to involve genocide denialism. It can just involve genocide silence, genocide non-representation. Third point is the contestation does not depend on specific factual claims, which we far too readily imagine it does. But it depends on the system of meaning which make those claims intelligible in certain ways or not. The system of meaning that you place on October 7th or Al-Aqsa flight makes it mean different things. The system of meaning you place on catastrophic scientific claims about climate change makes them mean different things. Okay. And for those systems to function, they need economic resources, they need technologies. The technologies are really important because they're really coming to the fore because of the rapidity of the change. In as much as in a sense, the ideological failure, the military success, but ideological failure of the Gaza genocide is because of TikTok. And TikTok is because of social media platforms, and social media platforms are because of mobile phones with cameras. And all of that didn't exist a couple of years ago. But that has been a catastrophe for genocidal Zionism. Okay, so it depends on economic resources, technologies, and the capacity to generate narratives that mesh with existing ideological systems. But having said that these narratives can be contested, and they can be contested in two primary ways that I can think of immediately. The one is with counter data, and I have this like data and empirical information as a form of contestation, but I'm not dissing it completely. We've just got to use it in ways that are effective within narrative construction. And by doing what I learned to do here a hell of a long time ago, reading Marx and Birmingham School of Cultural Studies and Althusser and all of that shit, is you can dismantle these things by ideological demystification and critical analysis, which I hope that's what they're teaching everyone to do here these days. Still, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I don't know, would you like to carry on standing, or do you want to, been standing quite a long time now, maybe take a seat while we take questions from the floor?
No,
stand.
I'll stand, it helps me breathe.
Okay, okay. I'll take a group of questions at a time, and okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Could we not charge the billionaires with the genocide of the human race? And I'm thinking a little bit of some of the statements that have been made. You know, things like Elon Musk's, well, we'll take a few of us off to Mars. So I'm starting to think that if we pay attention, we might find intent.
Yes.
Because
if
there's a kind of, you know, all of us won't survive, but some of us will. And those of us who've got the resources will survive. So it's starting to feel like there is something of a genocidal intent there.
Yes. You remember Oscar Peterson, Blade Runner?
Historian. Yes.
I'm sorry, historian. So he shot his girlfriend and like dudes do, you know, homicide, old story. And he got off in court initially because it was like, well, I just thought there was a burglar and shot them. And the court didn't be like, yeah, but you're not allowed to shoot burglars. Actually, no, that's homicide. They're not threatening you. And then they kind of had to retry him and look at this question of dolus eventualis, which is you don't have to intend something to be legally responsible. You just have to know that what you're doing, any reasonable person would see that that would lead to that outcome, and then you're criminally responsible. So in that sense, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are responsible for the end of the world because they know. And they know. And what's his name? Sam Altman, the ChatGPT dude. Like he literally goes in front of journalists and says, yeah, there's a 10% chance that AI will end the human race. And then what's going on in his head is, but we're going to make a shit ton of money before it does. I mean, we're going to make more money than humans have seen before. And then the human race will be over. He should be in jail. I mean, I don't understand the absence of scandal. I don't understand why people are not burning his effigy in the streets when he says things like that, because he means it. They are conscious. These people have access to the best knowledge in the world. They know what the consequences are, and they are choosing those consequences. And like, if someone said to you, look, we can do this, but there's a 10% chance you'll die, you're going to say no, right? You can go to the beach, but there's 10% chance you'll die. You're like, no, thanks. The chance needs to be 1 in a million for it to be worth it. But they're like, 10, 20% chance AI will kill us all. Climate change, it's not a 10 or 20% chance. If some radical new capacity is not developed to influence climate change, future generations will not exist. That is a scientific inevitability. And they know that. And the CEOs of Shell and those companies, they know that. And they're bankrolling politicians who refuse to implement climate safety. And they're buying those politicians. I mean, that's it. That's the way capitalism works. That's why capitalism and democracy are incompatible, because the rich people can bankroll politicians. So, yeah, that's a big problem.
And then thank you very much, Prof. Thank you so much. Very interesting. I had a conversation with Dr. Jean Dutoy last year, and she's talking about the importance of history and always going back to history and engaging with the sources. Thank you very much for bringing the Holocaust back to us. Now, I have a question. Where is Sudan exactly? And the question I have for you is, which crimes are worthy of global attention and which ones are not? Question 2. What does the genocide and others like it tell us about the status of human rights and civilian protection globally? You were saying in Hasbara, talking points that some advocates were being attacked, some human rights advocates were being attacked. But is it the end of the world? You are asking. I think it is, when they begin now to shut down even social media platforms. I wait to hear your response. Thank you, Prof.
Well, first off, there's so many things that I want to address. Okay. The question of Sudan, I kind of want to leave that with all of you as a problem. I don't want to solve that problem, but to say that when we compare Sudan to the Holocaust, to Palestine, I want you to note the catastrophic differential between the representations, and those differential representations have to do with a lot of things. Have to do with access to resources, it has to do with participation in certain kind of global economies, but it also has to do with how human life is ranked and why some lives are thought of by people in power as being less valuable than other lives. Okay. And that can change. And what we saw, I mean, this was the great success of the Holocaust in a perverse way, is that Jewish lives were not valued in Europe until the Holocaust. And then after the Holocaust, they were kind of hyper-valued. And so threats to Jewish life were seen as the most serious kinds of threats to human life. But we don't have to shut down social media. In fact, it is better for the predator class not to shut down social media. What they need to do is simply be controlling their algorithms. This apartheid idea of like censoring journalism, blacking out pages, putting journalists in jail. Not. That's nonsense. That's 20th century stuff. Now you've got to proactively engage media, and you can do it without walking out of your office, simply by coding the algorithms and saying that this kind of content is going to go to all of these people. This kind of content is going to be deprioritized. I mean, as a genocide scholar, I was getting for a long time overwhelmed by Gaza information. That is all but dried up now, and that is intentional. That is because there's a strategic recalibration of the algorithms by specific interests. And that's why I think the sale of US TikTok is a human rights catastrophe of a proportion that we're not beginning to imagine properly yet. I think that people will look back on 2025, 2026 and point to that. And I'll talk to you another day if you invite me back about the kind of algorithms, psychographic micro-targeting, and the formation of kind of subject positions and identities, and how that shit is about to go off the end of the cliff. Probably has already. But no, we don't need to they don't need to shut down social media. They need to engineer them much more effective. And they are, and they have. And so the big question, here's an empirical question that history is going to answer quite soon. Is Zionism going to re-legitimate itself successfully in the next year or two, or has it fully delegitimated itself in an irrecoverable way, despite managing to control social media algorithms? And I'd be interested to come back sometime and see what the answer to that has been, because we're going to see soon. It may be over. Many historians and politicians, Jewish historians and politicians in Israel, say that it's over. Zionism's collapsed the way apartheid collapsed. We had a question and a question there.
You mentioned it, well, it came to mind last night as well when you talked with the execution of Rene Good and then the Gaza genocide. Is the contestation that goes on between different sides. Yeah. On the one side, there's this clear evidence, as we talk about. On the other side, deniability. But I don't buy the denialism. It's a willing denialism. It's an active. There's so much evidence that
they do buy it, and they buy it so much that they pity you as a victim of propaganda.
You see, I don't believe that.
Hollywood.
They need to actively. It's an active denialism. It's not just something. It's not just an interpretation of evidence. It's actually an active thing that you have to go through. It's a decision.
It depends.
You have to take.
If you grow up where all your social meaning has been organized for you, so you grow up within, say, Zionist culture or capitalist culture, and everything you know, every version of history, every version of your identity and the relation of other people to you is already seamlessly packaged for you. You are fully interpolated in a kind of Althusserian way. Yeah. You don't have to do any extra work. That just manifests as obviously true to you. And that's what we've got to understand about how this stuff works. Is it appears to the end user and the subject of ideology as simply obviously true. It's obvious that all these images coming out of Gaza are fake. This is, that they've been generated by anti-Semites who hate Jews, and that's just obviously true to them. And there's no moment. I mean, Netanyahu knows what's going on, but your average subject of Zionism, whether they an American Zionist or a Christian Zionist in South Africa or a Zionist living in Israel, they literally don't know that. Like, the world really looks different to them than it looks to you. And they don't have to do any work for it to look like that. The work was done before their consciousness even formed.
You want to, okay, and then we'll take a comment there and then Lorenzo. Yep.
I must say, I'm with Pete on this, because if I think about my own growing up under apartheid, being at a Christian national school, in which we were schooled in a particular way to think, in which you were told, I do not speak about politics, I do not speak about sex, I do not speak about God. And that was something that you were told not just to do in public, but in private. So you had conversations with friends. You do not speak about those things. But it was a labor, it was a belabored construction. So as a group, we fought to deny. At a certain point,
okay, so for you as an individual within that group, you consciously felt yourself working.
I felt myself because I had access to other truths. I could see
that. That's the critical thing, is that the spell was already broken because you were making choices. You were saying, yeah, but there is this information, so I must work on this and that information. Whereas for some people, there is no other. It's all wrapped up.
But at a certain point, there was a tipping point when it became convenient for them to think differently. And it was remarkable how quick the shift was to a different perspective.
Yes. Yeah. Look. Yeah. Interest determine ideology. I'm just going to say it flat out. To that extent, I'm a Marxist determinist. To not most other extents. But yes, when it becomes convenient, beliefs change. And I'm not denying that for some people struggle in that transitional space of like trying to hold it together. And also many of my Jewish friends I've watched them struggling and weeping because they're like, but Zionism is what will save the Jews. And then they see the images and they're not fully denying those images, but they're freaking out and having complete existential kind of rupture. And like, what do? We can't abandon Zionism because that's literally the only thing that makes Jews safe on earth. But if what we're seeing is true, then Zionism is a hellscape, and we need to become enemies of it immediately. And I show my students this movie called Israelism, which I solidly recommend to everyone, which is about this experience of being inside of Zionism and feeling that glitch in the matrix, like feeling that, wait a minute, this is not explained by that. And the way in which these young American Zionists suddenly start being like, this is not right, and going from this is not right to, well, I've just been lied to being like super angry. And they do a kind of they are kind of deconditioned out of the cult of Zionism through this quite difficult process of their own, which is similar perhaps to what you're describing. And what's interesting to me in the movie Israelism is what are the precipitating moments? Like what for each of them has a different moment where it's like I was in this complete hermetically sealed explanatory world, and then the crack happened in the glass, and then everything started falling apart. And those precipitating moments are what really intrigued me, because I'm not really a determinist. I do still assert agency, but the agency, conditions of agency have to exist. And for some people, conditions of agency and critical reflection have not come into being yet. And I guess that's why I'm an academic, because that's my kind of crusade, is to bring the conditions of critical reflection into being, people who have not had access to them. Was it?
There's a question, two more questions.
So you sort of touched on part of what I wanted to ask, because I was going to ask that if we have this, like you said, almost inherited protectionism that Zionists had because of the Holocaust and stuff, what does genocide studies sort of offer as a solution to prevent that happening in future, that overcorrection, where we're saying, so let's say we recognize what's happening in Sudan, and then what prevents a situation where Sudanese people can behave in the way that the Israelis are behaving now, and it's like, oh, but they're sort of, insulated from that because they went through this horrible thing, so they've got right to sort of be a little bit shitty, as you say.
Yeah. Phew. That's such a fantastic question. And that's a whole literature. There's like literally brilliant minds have spent decades trying to solve this problem. And Germany tried to solve this problem and failed spectacularly, as we've now seen. They tried to deal with their own, the complicity of ordinary German society in the Holocaust. And they were like, well, firstly, you've got to admit what happened and you've got to take responsibility for it, because genociders almost never do. They always deny. And that is part of the reason we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not to create economic inequality in South Africa. And people keep being pissed off that it didn't do that. It couldn't do that and wasn't trying to do that. It was trying to create conditions under which people had to take responsibility for things in order that those kinds of things could not be gotten away with in the future by the same system of lies. And it really was an important kind of cultural work. It has not succeeded completely, or perhaps even very much at all. And Germany we now see that Germany is absolutely 100% gung-ho about the genocide of Palestinians. They've provided a third of all the military hardware that is being used for the Gaza genocide, while at the same time, taking classes every year to look at Holocaust museums and to weep over the errors of their forefathers, and then just be like, yeah, but send the bombs today. So it doesn't always work well, but we know that there are some things that work well. And one of the things that works is creating conditions where people can both change their understanding and their emotional relation to certain historical events. But that's a very big topic. I'd need to, and not just give you another lecture on, I need to give you a course on how that is thought about. Yeah.
Can you give us before the course a few of those authors' names, please, who wrote on this topic?
Yes, it's a lot, and there's a whole tradition that we'll firstly look at Holocaust studies and then genocide studies, because these are entire fields. And one of the big questions they ask is how do you prevent genocides? How do you prevent them emerging historically? How do you prevent the participation in them? And of course, one of the little throwaway things I said in the midst of this kind of rapid fire craziness of me going through too many points is that it may be that the next genocide doesn't need humans to be involved. It may be that it is fully automated luxury genocide. We now have the technological capabilities of that, and it scares the living hell out of me. Lorenzo has had a question for a long time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anthony. It's always very interesting to hear your talks. I have two questions, actually, comments. The first is if you have come across or if you think about a generational lapse to look at this issue. One of your last points was the emotional relationship with these events.
Yeah.
There is, in my opinion, there is a very strong generational component to that. If you look at Germany, the rise of the right wing, the extreme right.
Yeah.
These are the people who have never met people who were in the Second World War. Yeah. My generation was the last one of Europeans to meet people who actually were in the concentration camps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I think about Israel, this is a simplistic thing. You should never do that as a social scientist. But help me with the date. 48, it was established, and immediately it was at war. 67. Then in the 80s, the Intifada. Early 2000s, the other Intifada. And now again, 20 years apart. It's a generation. So the kids, they grow up with the stories of what happened, with the memories, their parents, etc.
Yeah.
This
is really important. And as much as I'm worried about, like Gaza, as I indicated yesterday, I'm worried about the rise of quasi-Nazi ideologies in the West at the moment, because people have forgotten what kind of hellscape that led to. And now they're just acting like, oh, well, we'll elect an American president who's functionally a neo-Nazi. And so the kind of historical forgetting and the way new generations don't do it, but the way in which sometimes they do, where the cultural apparatus of transmission keeps that memory alive. And Zionism has been very good at that. Zionism has been very good at keeping Holocaust trauma alive down multiple generations. And I think some of the best work I've done in the last few years is a paper called Irreconcilable Differences, which is a kind of trauma-informed approach to the emotional identifications of Zionists, as opposed to the way in which colonized people emotionally identify with Palestinians. Yeah.
I had a second.
Yeah.
Very quick. I'm sorry to shift back the focus to Europe. Unfortunately, that's where I come from. But there is something very interesting that I've come across by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German activist against Nazism, about the relationship between authoritarianism and stupidity. And it came to my mind when Peter was struggling a bit to articulate, the intentional and not understanding. In my opinion, stupidity as a technical term is worth investigating in relation to that. Because genocide, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, they used to create a stupid person in order to work. We need to create somebody who is able to know that something is not true, but believe it anyway. And who can put blind faith in the hands of people in authority. Who can just insulate themselves from what's happening, selectively decide what is true, what is not, and it can go on. And in my opinion, this is something that you see in general, this particular type of stupidity, you see it everywhere, all around the world and at all levels, not just in politics, you see it across the board. And let me stop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And I think that's really important, but I also think that creating participation through stupidity is one strategy. But once you get really good at ideological production, you become better at not needing stupidity anymore, and better at having really complex, thoughtful systems that people can't see the consequences of. And so there's a way of creating a intelligent fascism if you're prepared to do the ideological work to create it. But I don't want to even go down that route, because let's get rid of all of that stuff. Okay, is that it? Have we said what we're going to say? Okay.
Thank you so very, very much. What we say, it's been wonderful listening to you again. What always amazes me about the talks that I've attended given by you is the generosity of and breadth of your imagination and the clarity that you bring to some of these issues. So thank you very much. And I'm sure everyone can join me in giving Anthony a party. Please join us for a cup of tea outside.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
I was on the